So I will call us to order at 6:07. And I just have a couple of brief things to say. So I can't see the list of participants tonight, but on behalf of all of MAUSD, I just want to thank everybody for taking the time to join us tonight. This meeting is a special meeting of the school board, and you might have noticed that the agenda looks a little different. Tonight, for the first time, the board will be hearing from our superintendent, Patrick Reen, his recommendation for our schools and facilities. So during the first part of the meeting, the board will be listening and asking questions of Patrick. Please know that the board is not taking any action on the recommendation tonight. And I want to say that again. The board is not taking any action on the recommendation tonight. We will be gathering more feedback and comments through a survey and engagement events. Later on in the meeting tonight, we'll have a limited time for public comments and have asked the community members to use a speakers list if they wish to make a 1-minute comment. If you think of a question as you listen to the presentation, please jot it down, and don't worry if you're not able to make a comment. We have a FAQ document set up to collect the questions and get answers. The questions will be compiled and forwarded to the board for review and consideration. If you would like to ask your questions in person, or you just want to have a greater understanding of the recommendation, please join one of the events scheduled for next week on the 16th at 9 a.m. or the 17th at 6 p.m. These events are specifically for the community to ask questions and understand the ins and outs of the recommendation and the work that took place to arrive at it. During these events, the board will be listening as well. So at approximately 8:30 tonight, we will continue our scheduled board business and adjourn the meeting around 9. Now a few words to board members. Tonight, as we hear this recommendation, I would like everyone to be mindful of our role as board members. It is our job to care for MAUSD and make sure it can provide the education that our students deserve now and in the future. We are not just messengers between our community and our schools. As trustees for our schools, we are acting on behalf of our communities as a whole and taking an informed view of their best interests. We have to keep in mind the community as a whole, the education values we've heard expressed throughout this process, and the integrity of MAUSD, and using all that information to define the future direction of our schools. The voters have elected us to make sure that our schools are meeting the desired outcomes for our students, and they're expecting us to make the decisions that get us there. And sometimes that might mean making tough decisions. If we keep those core values in mind, I don't think we can go wrong. So at this point, I will turn it over to Patrick.
All right, good evening, everyone. First, I want to start with a little housekeeping. So I really encourage the board to stop me at any time with questions or comments that surface for you throughout the presentation. I think it's going to be easier for you doing it that way than it would be waiting until the end. If you ask a question that I think I'm going to address later in the presentation, I can let you know that we'll get to it later on. Please remember that while I'm screen sharing, I won't be able to see any of you, so please jump in and ask your question. I also want to mention that I'm going to be toggling back and forth a bit between two screens while I'm sharing my screen with you. This is still pretty new to me, but I think it'll be better for you as the viewer. So while you'll only see one screen when I'm sharing my screen with you, you may see me look up from time to time at my other screen as I navigate this. So thanks for your patience as I work to do that. I think it's also important to know that behind the data that you're going to see tonight, there are many supporting spreadsheets. So if you want to dig deeper into some of the data, feel free to email Floyd or I after the meeting, but I'm not going to go deep into those spreadsheets in tonight's presentation. Having said that, what you will see for data tonight looks 2 to 5 years out, which means there are many projections that we've had to make. With so many moving parts, we've done our best to give you as accurate a projection as we can and have attempted to explain some of the more significant variables that may impact our decisions down the road. So with those housekeeping aspects, are there any questions about those? And again, board members, just jump in if you do have some questions. I can't see all of the faces right now.
I see that Dave Sharp needs to be let in.
Okay. I think Katrina should be on that now then.
Okay.
All right, so if there aren't any questions, tonight I'm going to be recommending action that I think the MAUSD board should take to help provide our students with the best education possible in a way that will be supported by our community. My recommendation takes into consideration the thoughts, opinions, and beliefs that I've gathered from hundreds upon hundreds of conversations I've had with a wide variety of community members over the past 12 to 18 months. It will also include my knowledge of our education system, ways in which we need to grow to support our students, and the harsh realities of our financial future. I will make clear the path I think we should follow, and will also articulate alternative paths with the goal of helping the board and our community understand what we might expect our future to look like for each path that may be chosen. Tonight's recommendation did not come easily to me. There are many competing interests to consider and a lot of emotions connected to these interests. I wish we were not in a position to have to make hard decisions regarding our future, but unfortunately we are. Much as I would love to hand the responsibility of making a recommendation off to someone else or some committee, I accept the responsibility I hold as superintendent to lead MAUSD. Though I'm confident in my recommendation, I know it will land hard for some, while others may feel relieved. Some will feel the need to vilify me for the recommendation I make as part of their processing. Others will want to poke holes in the data. Still others will want to make the case that someone or something will be coming to solve our problems for us, or that we shouldn't make any decision anytime soon, given COVID, the national political scene, etc. I accept these responses as reactions to the hard work of facing our reality and making change. And still, my recommendation will be to face our challenges head on and take action to move us forward toward a more positive future than I believe we will realize if we make no plan and take no action. As you will see later, taking no action is actually taking significant action. So let's make sure our actions move us toward our desired future. Tonight's recommendation is a milestone for our collective work and represents where my thinking has evolved to over the past 18 months or more. I want to thank the board, the Facilities Feasibility Study Committee, the Community Engagement Committee, the leadership team, central office staff, school staff, students, and the hundreds of community members that attended a variety of forums, town halls, select board meetings, or completed surveys. I also want to thank our consultant, Sue McCormick, for her support over the past 14 months or more. The conversations she's helped us have as a community, the thinking that has been shared, and the advocacy that has been demonstrated has truly shaped my thinking and has been instrumental in helping me fulfill my daunting responsibility of making a recommendation for a path forward. There is no doubt we are at a critical juncture as a school district and as a community. Our enrollment has been declining for years and is projected to continue to decline. Declining enrollment results in reducing the amount we can spend before paying tax penalties for exceeding the spending threshold. Without change of significant magnitude, we're facing large tax increases and millions of dollars in annual tax penalties. Assuming our taxpayers have little interest for increasing taxes and paying millions in penalties, we're left with the need to reduce spending. With personnel costs making up approximately 75% of our total budget, every situation involving significant spending cuts is primarily driven by personnel reductions. Knowing this, we can either try to keep as much of what we have now as we can while we reduce dozens and dozens of positions, or we can look for ways to operate differently with fewer staff as we pursue improved outcomes for our students. Without creating some staffing efficiencies, we risk drastically reduced supports and services for our students. Now, I know this may sound and feel hopeless, but I'm here to tell you it isn't. Despite our challenge, we can and we must continue to pursue improved outcomes for our students. Maintaining status quo is not enough. Providing less support and services to our students is unacceptable. Like most challenges we face, there are opportunities we can take advantage of, possibilities we wouldn't think of if not faced with such a formidable challenge. Tonight, I'm going to recommend we face this challenge head on and from a possibilities mindset rather than a deficit mindset. I'm going to light a path for us that allows us to build something together as a community. A path that meets our financial challenges and is focused on improving outcomes for our students. Now give me just a minute to share my screen. All right, I'll trust someone to tell me if they can't see that well right now. You should be able to see my screen. And this is, again, where I lose everyone's face. So board members, chime in if you have a comment or a question as we're working through this. As we dive into this conversation, it's important to note that we've been here before. Over the past 100 years or so, the educational system in our five-town area has undergone significant change. Conversations we're having now are likely very similar to conversations our foremothers and forefathers had in the past. In the late 1800s, the five towns that now make up MAUSD had a combined total of 58 schools. 9 in Bristol, 12 in Lincoln, 10 in Moncton, 12 in New Haven, and 15 in Starksboro. As transportation improved, towns reduced the number of schools, presumably to increase efficiency and reduce the number of facilities to maintain. By the early to mid-1900s, towns each had a single school serving students through grade 12. In the mid-1900s, our five towns came together in pursuit of providing more robust programming for our students in grades 7 through 12 in a more efficient manner. Rather than continuing to replicate programming for smaller pockets of our secondary students across multiple schools throughout our five towns, voters agreed to form a supervisory union and have a single union high school built. From this, the Addison Northeast Supervisory Union was created, and subsequently the Mount Abraham Union Middle High School was built. It opened its doors to students in the fall of 1968, and construction was completed by summer of 1969. For the past 50 years, Mount Abe has provided a program of studies that each town almost certainly could not have provided on their own at a reasonable cost. From the mid-1900s until 2017, each of these five towns operated its own town school district with its own school board, which governed the town's elementary school and sent representatives to the supervisory union board to govern all things common to the supervisory union, including the Union Middle High School. This meant there were 7 school boards operating 6 schools. After an affirmative vote from all 5 towns on November 8th, 2016, the Mount Abraham Unified School District was born and became operational on July 1st of 2018. Under MAUSD, all 6 schools in these 5 towns are governed by a single board with trustees from each of the 5 towns. Here we are in 2020, and once again, our 5-town community is faced with both a challenge and an opportunity. Change is inevitable. Status quo is not an option. We can either choose to allow change to happen to us, or we can become the architects of our future and design a school district that provides robust supports and opportunities for our students in a way that is financially sustainable and supported by our community. Before we dig into the possibilities tonight, it's important to understand how I arrived at presenting these possibilities. The Community Engagement Committee has done a tremendous job over the past 14 months or so, sharing information and gathering input with a great balance of thin and thick engagement opportunities. Their process has included literally hundreds of community members. Throughout the fall and early winter last year, these events produced an artifact that has become a driving force behind the work that has taken place over the past 12 months or so, specifically the community values. These values and the community conversations that shaped them were instrumental in the board's Saturday retreat last January, where the board, along with the entire team of MAUSD administrators and members of the Community Engagement Committee, worked all day to consider at least 7 or 8 options for further study before ultimately landing on 4. At a special board meeting in February following the January retreat, the board directed me to enlist a consultant to study the 4 scenarios that surfaced at the January retreat. Those 4 scenarios were scenario 1, which is 5 elementary schools and 1 middle high school. Scenario 2A, which was 2 elementary schools and a 6-12 middle high school. Scenario 2B, which was 2 elementary schools, 1 middle school, 1 high school. And scenario 7, which was 1 K-8 school and high school choice. The board did add at its meeting to this list by directing me to study the option of keeping elementary schools open and closing the middle high school. There was also discussion about involving the board in the process of working with the consultant hired to study these scenarios. This conversation led to action at the following board meeting in March. At its regular meeting in March, the board approved the Advisory Feasibility Study Committee charge. The committee included 2 community representatives, 2 board representatives, and 3 central office administrators, including myself, the assistant superintendent, and the business manager. This committee was formed to advise me as I worked with the consultants to study the 4 scenarios identified by the board while keeping the community values, essential questions, and the costs, benefits, and challenges of each scenario in mind. The study committee met monthly from May through November. Early on, a lot of discussions helped to orient the community members to our situation. Over time, the committee began peeling back the layers of complexity. As committee members deepened their understanding of the situation, thoughts and opinions became more divergent. Hearing the divergent thinking was valuable to me as it represented the various thoughts and perspectives that exist in our community. A bit of a turning point occurred when a key understanding surfaced as the committee persevered through a marathon 3.5-hour meeting in early November. Much of the conversation to that point had been understanding the benefits of small schools and the impacts on losing small schools. Even a lot of the research the committee reviewed spoke to small schools versus large schools. What surfaced in this marathon meeting was the recognition that, at least on a national scale, every scenario we could consider left our community with small schools. Even all of our elementary students in a single building would be a small school by national standards. What we were really discussing was the impact of having or losing town schools. After 7 months of discussions, the committee ultimately recommended to me 1 scenario that kept all schools open, 1 scenario that closed some schools, and 1 scenario that had us merging with Addison Northwest. As the study committee's work was drawing to a close, efforts began to connect me with select boards of each of our 5 towns. Having done some research on the impact closing schools can have on towns, I concluded that it depends on the town. In order to understand the impact, it felt important to me to talk to leaders in each town to learn more about what makes up the fabric of their town and what role the school has in creating that fabric. What I found in talking with town leaders, and what turned out to be many town residents as well, was strikingly similar. Each town spoke passionately about their town elementary school. To each town, their school is unique and special. It's where students make friends, and where adults first meet some of their fellow townspeople. In more than one town, someone mentioned moving to that town for the elementary school, or perhaps moving back to that town for the elementary school. The schools are often a gathering place for school functions and town functions. In some of our towns, a school building is the only gathering place. At each of these meetings, I heard very passionately from people that they loved their town school and were not ready or willing to see it close. I wasn't really expecting to hear people say they wanted their school to close at any of these meetings. And truth be told, I didn't want to hear that. Hearing how much people love their town school is a testament to the great work that is happening at each of our schools. Our schools are deserving of the high praise they receive. What I did hear a lot about, which is what I needed to learn, was what each community saw as the benefits of having a school in their town. Unfortunately, hearing this didn't make our financial challenges go away. In fact, hearing this only made the challenge that much greater because it confirmed for me what I already believed to be true, which is towns are nowhere near ready to close their schools. So the question I was still left with answering was, how do we find the savings we need while improving outcomes for our students without closing any schools? This question's been on my mind for months and was re-emphasized for me in my meetings with select boards and community members. As I said before, tonight I'm going to recommend we face this challenge head on and from a possibilities mindset rather than a deficit mindset. I'm going to light a path for us that allows us to build something together as a community. A path that meets our financial challenges and is focused on improving outcomes for our students. It is, however, not without having to make hard decisions. I know many people desperately want to keep everything the way it is. We all want to cling to the image of our town school as we know it now or as we once knew it. The sad reality is that is just not an option. If we do not act swiftly and significantly, the schools everyone knows and loves now, or perhaps remember from their past, will be just a shell of what they are or once were. Letting the supports and services we provide our students rapidly deteriorate until everyone's unhappy enough with them that we're willing to make change is irresponsible and is harmful to students. Following my meetings with select boards, I found myself thinking, since our communities aren't ready to close any of our elementary schools, with good reason, how can we utilize our buildings differently to improve outcomes for students and meet our financial challenges? In essence, how can we begin to view the underutilization of our buildings as an asset rather than a liability? It is with this thinking that I make my recommendation to you tonight. As our foremothers and forefathers did before us, I encourage us to make the hard decisions we need to make now to help ensure we provide our children with the best future we can. To that end, I recommend the MAUSD board not close any schools. Instead, I recommend the MAUSD board take a phased approach, allowing us to begin reimagining and redesigning the way we educate our children. I want to play a short video that captures the essence of what I mean. In this video, we're going to hear from Ted Dintersmith. He's the author of What School Could Be, also co-authored the book Most Likely to Succeed, and is the producer of the documentary with the same title, Most Likely to Succeed. It's very worth watching if you haven't already. So let's take just a minute and watch this video. Take that back. Let's take about 6 minutes to watch this video. Someone let me know if the sound isn't coming through okay on your end, please.
It is arguably the hardest time in the history of education, the hardest time in the history of our country. And so I know you're dealing with just remarkably large, often daunting challenges. But I just want to say, I think parents, I think people broadly have a newfound recognition for the role that educators play in the lives of their kids and also the future of their communities. And I just want to really say from the bottom of my heart how grateful I am to you for all you're doing, because it just sets a tone for what our country's capable of when you see that kind of passion and dedication and commitment. I want to talk a little bit about some of the things that I think I've picked up from you over the period of time I've been immersing myself in this world of education. And I still don't view myself, by the way, as any form of expert. I feel like I'm a plagiarist, right? I just listen and learn from you guys and then try to say back the things that you're doing that make so much sense. But as many of you know, we have developed this resource we call the Innovation Playlist, which was based on 5 big ideas. And those 5 big ideas were the things that when those were in place, teachers, schools, districts could make enormous progress, even states. First, I think it's indispensable to bring a community together, to recognize, to see, to appreciate a different vision of education, and to get excited about it. If your community's behind you, you can do amazing things. And then when you look at the way kids learn, the places that I think we're making incredible progress, in normal times, were the places where students had real voice in their learning, where the learning was connected to the real world, where students could see why it's real, and then where you were trusted to develop more authentic assessments, where you assess student work on the basis of evidence of mastery and real accomplishment instead of bubble tests. And then the final big idea, the fifth big idea, was to make sure every kid felt like they were part of a caring and connected community. What has been so interesting, right, is as I check back with the places we filmed and the places I've written about, the people I've interviewed and talked about and brought to life, I've asked them, how did the spring go? How has this fall gone? And they said, no doubt we're in a world of challenge. No doubt the inequities that have run through our system and differentially impacted young kids in ways that I think should be off the table in terms of acceptability in our country. All those inequities have been magnified. But places that had those 5 big ideas in place shared with me again and again, there was no drop off in learning. A kid who can manage their own learning, can pick what they're interested in, can draw on resources around them, can create and carry out bold initiatives. That kid can do it whether they're in school or out of school. Teachers that reimagine their role as being guiding and inspiring their kids instead of instructing them report it was actually, I could pop in, I could do informal, office hour sessions, I could answer questions, I could give encouragement. So there was really no diminution in learning during this bollock stuff time, despite a lot of other challenges. The thing I really want to focus on is we're all exposed to the national narrative, right? If we don't get our kids quickly back to normal school, a whole generation is at risk. And to that I say, normal school is not the solution. Normal school is the problem. Normal school is what was putting an entire generation of kids at risk. If we continue to do things in school that value kids for their ability to retrieve content, replicate low-level procedures, and follow instructions, we're pushing out a generation of kids that are good at exactly what computers do perfectly. And so here's what I worry about, but here's what I'm optimistic about. I worry if we just try to port a failed model, a model that didn't work that well in person, put it on Zoom, sort of make the sense that this will be a lost year come to reality, because we all sort of throw up our hands and know that's ineffective. If that's what we do, if that's what we make it this year, we will, to use something from Hamilton, we will have missed our shot. This is our moment. Nobody can make heads or tails of these state mandated exams. They weren't given last spring, so those tests aren't going to mean anything. Nobody's looking over your shoulder to see where you are in standardized curriculum. Colleges are dropping the ACT and SCT, like there's no tomorrow. Those tests are on their way out. And all of those built-in patterns of behavior and expectations that school should be the way it's always been, they're off the table. So the door is wide open. And if we just sort of step back and say, now's the time for us to move forward with the kind of school we've always wanted to have, instead of the kind of school we inherited. We know how to do this. We can draw on our successes and strengths. I think this year will be a year we look back on and say, this was not the lost year, this was the found year. And we have unleashed so much potential among our students and our teachers, potential that normal school all too often squanders. And we can set the stage for remarkable learning year in and year out for years to come. And so, again, enormous gratitude, respect, and appreciation for what you're doing. And together, I think we can show the world just what's possible.
So I think that video has certainly captured better than I could articulate to you kind of the idea behind my recommendation. And so to start us down this path, phase one, as I mentioned, this is a phased approach that I'm recommending. Phase 1 of my recommendation requires us to repurpose and retool our schools to provide our students with outstanding core instruction, high quality intervention, and top-notch related arts experiences, while also charging our educational leaders to work with students, staff, and the community to co-create an innovative program available to all students, which may provide an experiential, project, or performance-based, hands-on kind of experience. This program could focus on the environment, performing arts, humanities, STEM, or wherever the co-creation process takes us. Could include tapping into our rich community resources to provide a deep community connection as we work together to provide relevant, lasting learning opportunities for our students. I do want to acknowledge the fact that the repurposing of schools does not require a vote of the electorate. That is a decision that the board has the authority to make. While this simplifies things in some ways, it most certainly adds pressure to the board. I don't take this lightly, given the impact the board's actions can have on our community. Still, I believe this is our best path forward for the foreseeable future. Phase 2 would be to merge districts with Addison Northwest. This would begin by this board acting swiftly to form a study committee with the same action taking place in Addison Northwest. Then, over the next several months, the joint study committee would look closely at what a merged district could look like, draft articles of agreement to be reviewed by the State Board of Ed, and then ultimately be put to a vote of each community. A yes from the commingled votes of the 5 towns in MAUSD, and a yes from the commingled votes of the 5 towns in Addison Northwest would result in forming a newly merged district. Ideally, and this is important, this newly formed district would become operational on July 1st of 2023 in order to benefit from the financial savings before supports and services for students are lost. This newly merged district would create staffing efficiencies at the central office level, as well as at the middle and high school levels. These efficiencies would save money while expanding programs for secondary students. This merger would also be necessary to be able to sustain phase 1 of my recommendation. Also, all students in the newly merged district would be able to access the programming described in phase 1. So let's take a little bit of a closer look at what phase 1 would look like. In phase 1, Moncton Central and Bristol Elementary Schools would become K-5 schools serving students from all 5 towns. Beeman would be the site of an enhanced pre-K childcare and central office. The enhanced pre-K childcare would serve approximately the same number of students that we serve now in pre-K, only families would receive wraparound childcare. For example, currently, families who are able to take advantage of the 10 hours of free pre-K need to have a schedule that enables them to bring the child in and pick them up, and they need to find care that is flexible enough to supplement the hours the child's not in pre-K. For some families, this is a barrier to accessing the 10 free hours. The idea of the enhanced pre-K childcare is that our ELP program would provide care in the same building where the children attend pre-K. For families, this means they can drop their child off each day at the same time in the same place and pick them up at the end of the day. In phase 1, Robinson and Lincoln would become innovation sites where the programming that would be co-created would take place. Ideally, in addition to providing innovative programming for students, one or both of these sites would provide job-embedded experiences for classroom teachers to take back and infuse into their classrooms. Also in phase 1, 6th graders would attend Mount Abe, making it a 6-12 school. This would offer 6th graders access to the kinds of programming currently available to middle schoolers. So here's what Bristol Elementary could look like as a K-5 school. As you can see, there would be approximately 351 students in the 22-23 school year. Class sizes would average 19.5 students. Kindergarten classes would be able to retain an instructional assistant to support kindergartners as they navigate the school environment. Students would benefit from access to a full-time nurse and counselor. All students would receive robust supports for, all students would receive robust health education, which is not currently afforded to all students. Staffing would include robust supports for students from behavior support personnel, interventionists, and special educators. Classroom teachers would still be able to benefit from the support provided by 2 instructional coaches. Special area staffing levels would be sufficient to support student need, provide some flexibility in scheduling, and help ensure we meet contractual planning time requirements for classroom teachers. As you can see here, indicated by the green boxes, the building is well utilized with room for growth. According to NESDEC, Bristol Elementary has a possible planned operating capacity of 459 students. We know historically this building has had 498 students enrolled. At 351 students, BES would be operating at 76% of the planned operating capacity in this scenario. So here's what Moncton Central School would look like as a K-5 school. In the 2022-2023 school year, there'd be approximately 171 students. Class sizes at the K2 level would be in the 17 to 19 range, while class sizes at the 3 through 5 level would be 20 to 23. The average class size, which is reflected here, would be 19 students. Kindergarten classes would be able to retain an instructional assistant to support kindergartners as they navigate the school environment. Students would benefit from access to a full-time nurse and counselor. All students would receive robust health education, which is not currently afforded to all students. Staffing would include robust supports for students from behavior support personnel, interventionists, and special educators. Classroom teachers would still be able to benefit from the support provided by 1 instructional coach. Special area staffing levels would be sufficient to support student needs and provide some flexibility in scheduling and help ensure we meet contractual planning time requirements for classroom teachers. As you can see here, indicated by the green boxes, the building is well utilized with room for growth. According to NESDEC, Moncton has a possible planned operating capacity of 235. At 171 students, Moncton would be operating at 73% of the planned operating capacity. In phase 1, staffing at Mount Abe would look essentially the same as it does now, even though they would be taking in another grade with approximately 98 students. As a result, utilization of Mount Abe would look a lot like it does now, with some shuffling of classrooms likely needed to create a middle school section of the building that can accommodate the added students. The details of this would be determined over the next year and a half. Here's a look at the second story floor plan at Mount Abe. Additional staffing efficiencies and program benefits at Mount Abe would be realized in phase 2 as we merge with Addison Northwest. I'll talk more about this in a moment. With 6th grade at Mount Abe, enrollment is projected to be approximately 701 students in the 22-23 school year. According to NESDEC, Mount Abe has a planned operating capacity of 970. At 701 students, Mount Abe would be operating at 72% of the planned capacity. I want to acknowledge here that phase 1, though it does not technically close any schools, may feel that way to some residents, and it may have a similar impact on the community. There are many beliefs about ways not having a town school might impact a town. These include deterring young families from moving in or staying in town, reduced community connection, reduced home values, and economic stress, to name a few. From my perspective, the research on this is inconclusive and often focuses on small schools versus large schools, which is less relevant to us since every scenario for us keeps our schools small on a national scale. What makes the impact even less clear is the difficulty in comparing the impact losing a really strong elementary town school can have on a town to the impact of operating an under-resourced elementary town school. A bit later, we're going to look at the impact of the possible staffing reductions we're facing. And that's part of what we'll have to imagine is that future with those staffing reductions and the impact keeping schools under those circumstances would have on each of our towns. Here we start to dive into the financial impact of repurposing schools and our projections for the FY23. And we're looking here at projections with and without the impact of the weighting study. So let me explain what the weighting study is. To control the cost of education in Vermont, the state requires cost per equalized pupil to be a driving factor in building budgets and setting local tax rates. To acknowledge that students have different needs and that those needs require different staffing levels or different levels of support, a formula was created a number of years ago which assigns different weights to students with different needs. For example, an elementary student is weighted less than a secondary student. A student on an IEP is weighted more heavily than a student who is not. A student eligible for free lunch is weighted more heavily than a student who is not. This formula, which includes all of our enrolled students and their associated weights, produces an equalized pupil count for MAUSD. We divide our education spending, which is our total spending minus revenue, by this equalized pupil count, and that is what gives us our cost per equalized pupil. The state then sets a limit on the amount we can spend per equalized pupil before a tax penalty is assessed. This is the spending threshold. Now, a couple of years ago, the state wanted to see if the formula used to produce our equalized pupil count was still an equitable way to control education spending in Vermont. To find out, they commissioned a study of the weighting formula, affectionately known as the weighting study. The conclusion of this study was that our formula needs to be changed. There are several versions of changes proposed, and they all result in MAUSD losing equalized pupils, somewhere around a 6% reduction. With fewer equalized pupils, the less we can spend before exceeding that spending threshold. Now we start this spreadsheet with the amount we need to spend, or the amount we need to reduce spending by to stay at the spending threshold. Without the weighting study, you can see that we need to save over $3 million, and with the weighting study, we need to save closer to $4.5 million. Keeping this in mind for FY23, which is the budget that will be, keep in mind that this is for FY23, which is the budget we're going to be building at this time next year. Now, when we get to the shaded boxes, we start to look at some variables that are more or less outside of our control, but could impact us pretty significantly. This is an attempt to account for some of the what ifs. The unshaded cells show the savings from repurposing, as well as an approximated cost of the innovative programming. Green and red figures show where our spending would be relative to the threshold. Under the threshold is green, over the threshold is red. So as you can see here, phase one is projected to essentially be sustainable for FY23, regardless of which way these variables go. If some of the variables go our way, we could be well under the spending threshold. So again, I think it's important to highlight here the savings from the repurposing that we talked about are somewhere in the neighborhood of $5.5 million. Those are pretty significant savings, and they go a long way to help us through our financial challenges.
Hey, Patrick.
Yes.
It's Krista. Were you going to come back to, you talked a little bit about what Beeman would look like and Moncton and Bristol, but we didn't hear about Starksboro or Lincoln. Is that coming up or?
So the idea there is the kind of programming that we were looking at would take place there. So it's hard to begin to talk with any kind of detail about what that looks like in those buildings, because it depends so much on that co-creation process. The idea is, I can elaborate a little bit. The idea is that the programming that happens there be available to all students. Some ideas that surfaced through these conversations were centered around the idea of creating magnet schools. The problem with magnet schools is, we work to create these really great things, and then we have a process that is sort of a lottery or an application process. And so we say, hey, here's this great thing, this magnet school, and not all of you get to have the experience that we provide here. Some do, some don't. Philosophically, that's really hard for me. I think it goes against what we're trying to build from an equity perspective. So whatever the programming looks like there, we need to make sure that it's something that can be accessed by all students. beyond that, really what that can look like and how we provide that access to all students depends on the program, and there are a lot of different ways that can look. But the idea is that those buildings have students in them practically every day. You know, depending on if there are different kinds of sessions, there may need to be periods of time in between to sort of gear down from one session and gear up for the next. But otherwise, the idea is that those are busy places with students in them routinely. You know, conceptually, as we saw in that video, the opportunity to really bring the community in, thinking about, you know, some performance event or demonstration that students deliver, those become hubs for our 5-town community to see what's happening in those places. And that doesn't take away from the other kind of traditional events that might happen in the other schools. But that would be unique to those programs in those schools.
Patrick, it's Sarah McLean. Do you have a map that shows the boundaries for which elementary K-5 kids would go to Bristol and which kids would go to Moncton based on phase 1? And then also, as far as the phase 1 financials, is phase 1 just deferring a town vote for a year until phase 2? And then in phase 2, when we would consolidate with Northwest, that's when we would ask the towns to potentially vote to close their schools?
No, so I do not have I don't have the map drawn yet of where the divide would be. There'd have to be a lot of study put into that and really understanding what the best approach would be there. And some of those boundaries, you know, whether all students from New Haven go to Bristol or some go to Moncton, same thinking about Robinson. I think we need to explore that more fully with some eyes wide open as to what makes the most sense as we try to utilize buildings the way that I'm describing in this proposal. I think in terms of your second question around the financials, what we're talking about here isn't closing schools in that they are still being used for educational purposes. So that does not require at any point in time a vote of the electorate. What would require a vote of the electorate would be to merge with Addison Northwest or not. So phase 1 acts in the way that we have authority to act and starts to realize savings and starts to reimagine programming. Phase 2, which is kind of separate from phase 1, is the merger and would need ultimately a vote of the electorate for that to take place and to realize those savings and those efficiencies and those program expansions. Does that answer your question?
It does, yes. For now, I'll let you continue.
All right. And Krista, did I fully respond to your question? As much as I can fully respond to it now?
Yes, thank you.
All right, so we're looking right now at FY23 in phase 1, but I also want to take us out a little bit further looking at FY26 in phase 1. So now looking at FY26, we can see that from a financial standpoint, phase 1 alone falls short of meeting our financial realities. So with the kind of programming that we're talking about in both the weighting study, or sorry, no weighting study and weighting study versions, the savings that we experience, though significant, you can see those savings have increased now because this is now a few years later. So salaries have gone up, et cetera. So those savings are greater at that point. We're still, you know, $2.5 to almost $4 million over the spending threshold that we're projecting in FY26. Without the weighting study, if some of these other factors go our way, we get pretty close, being around $250,000 over the spending threshold, which I would say projecting 5 years out, the margin of error is easily $274,000. But when we're looking at the scenario that does factor in the weighting study, we're still pushing $1.5 million over the spending threshold. So all of this to say that the reconfiguration savings with the added cost of the innovative programming would get us by for a while, but is not sustainable long term. So the merger becomes necessary for additional savings to make this sustainable. So with that, let's take a closer look at phase 2. Phase 2 again is merging districts with Addison Northwest and expanding programming at the middle and high school level. In a merged district, all the elementary schools in MAUSD would be used the same way as in phase 1. The exception being that Beeman would be enhanced pre-K and central office for the newly formed district rather than just MAUSD. All students in the newly formed district would be able to access the innovative programs at Robinson and Lincoln. Ferrisburg and Virgins Union Elementary Schools could be K-5 schools with a 6-8 students from the newly merged district attending school at the Virgins Union Middle High School campus, and all 9-12 students attending school at the Mount Aid campus. Obviously, lots of conversation would need to be had. This is all part of what the study committee, the merger study committee, would need to be looking at more closely. My thinking with the 6-8 and 9-12 being where they are is really simply a factor of a larger footprint at Mount Abe and the fact that there are more students in 9-12 than a 6-8. There are plenty of other factors that could be considered and should be considered. I'm going with something for people to wrap their mind around based on square footage and number of kids. The anticipated enrollment in a merged 6-8 middle school is about 475, whereas in a merged 9-12 high school enrollment is anticipated at about 700. So that's kind of the difference in what the enrollment would look like. We would continue to use the Addison Central School campus as we are now to provide the same programming as is happening now at the Addison Wayfinder Experience program, which provides an alternative education for Addison County students in grades 7 through 12. Obviously, again, lots of conversations. I'm not making presumptions here about what would or wouldn't happen in Addison Northwest. This is trying to present an idea about what could happen in a merged district. So without a merger, this is important to understand, without a merger, and especially without a merger or a reconfiguration or closure, middle and high school students will see significant reductions in programs across content areas, including English, math, science, social studies, art, music, world language, design technology, athletics and activities. Additionally, students will have reduced access to support such as special education, intervention, behavior supports, guidance, and nursing. With a merger, and especially with a merger and a reconfiguration or closure, students will maintain programming in all of these areas and actually likely see expansions in at least a couple of these areas, thinking about at least music and world language are ways we could see expansions. So pretty stark difference between what we can provide all of our students. We've talked some about elementary students. We'll talk more about that, but in particular our secondary students in a merger and the efficiencies that we can create, which produce the savings we need and maintain and even expand the programs that we can offer. So here we take a look out at FY26 to see how sustainable this plan is with and without factoring in the weighting study. As you can see, this plan is essentially sustainable out to FY26 without the weighting study, even if some of these other factors don't go our way. However, when we factor in the weighting study, it looks like we will need some of these other factors to go our way to sustain this plan. I should add here that, again, using my crystal ball, which I actually do have, I don't know how effective it really is, but I do have a crystal ball. I do think the weighting study is likely to happen. It was gaining a lot of momentum prior to COVID in the legislature, and I think it's going to be something that is a prominent discussion in the upcoming session. I do think there's going to be action on that, and I think the action is going to be to move forward with changing that weighting formula, that weighting study. I do hope that it's done with a phased-in approach, so we don't experience that, $1+ million in 1 year, that maybe it's spread out over time. I also do think the special education block grant is going to happen. You can see here that the education block grant kind of accompanies the weighting study. And this would bring some additional revenue our way to the tune of almost $290,000. So those are two things that I feel pretty confident are going to happen. They're not done deals by any means, but I feel pretty confident that they will. I'm less confident, but optimistic about the removal of the construction costs from equalized pupil. So let me talk about that for just a minute. There was some movement in the legislature prior to COVID to introduce a bill that would remove construction costs that are in our general budget from being counted against our cost per equalized pupil. The reason for that is if we were successful in securing a bond to make some of the improvements that we've been making, and that $1 million that we have in the budget to improve our facilities was being put into a bond instead, that bonded amount would, that money that we pay for the bond payment would not count against our cost per equalized pupil. However, because we didn't pass a bond and that $1 million is in our general fund, it does count against us. So I think the bill that was being introduced was gaining some favor as well. I'm hopeful that there's going to be some movement on that this coming session. And I know there's a lot on the plate of our legislature. So I'm optimistic, but I'm less confident that that's going to gain any traction. I have spoken with the representative that was really working to support this bill and move this forward. And he's committed again to bringing it forward in this next session. So we'll see where that goes. And that has a big impact on us. That's $1 million that comes off of our cost per equalized pupil. This may become an area where if folks were interested in advocating to the legislature for something that would be helpful, this could be something that could be really productive for us. And the last piece that's on here that you've seen on some of the other slides, I really have no idea about the legislature's interest or willingness to raise the spending threshold at this point. I simply put this in here for consideration because typically we see the spending threshold increase by about 2.3%, give or take, year over year. However, the spending threshold, given the COVID economy and the formula for setting the spending threshold is statutorily driven. So there's not a lot of option in how that formula is sort of put into practice. But that formula produced a 0.18% increase in the spending threshold. So I know the legislature has the authority to override that and change that spending threshold. I don't know if they'll have the appetite or the interest in doing it, but I put it on here as something that maybe could happen. And again, if there was some advocacy at the legislative level, maybe that would be helpful in this scenario as well.
Patrick, this is Sarah McLean again. Can
Go
you flesh out a little bit what the sustained value for the district is of having multiple innovation sites?
So when you say the sustained value, what do you mean?
I mean, phase one, we're converting repurposing a couple of elementary schools into innovation sites. Phase two, you know, if the collective town district just chooses to vote to merge with Northwest, then we're, according to what I'm seeing here, we still have those innovation sites as part of the district. So I'm curious, so I was trying to put a more possibilities edge on it, but I could also ask it, what is the cost to the district of maintaining multiple innovation sites?
Yeah, so if you look at the innovative program cost in these different tables here, that is the cost for that program. And that includes personnel costs at each site, as well as the operational costs to, for example, plow the buildings and heat the buildings and pay for the electricity, those sorts of things. So you can see the cost in 26 is just over 1.3 million. I think it was just over 1.1 in FY23. And that reflects the reality of increasing personnel costs and things of that nature. So trying to have that reflect a fairly reasonable growth that we might expect to really test its sustainability. Does that answer your question? Is that what you're looking for?
Yes, it does. And I guess what I'm also looking for is just a little bit more detail of what these programs look like and which students the innovative sites serve.
Yeah, so in phase one, the students that would be served would be MAUSD students because we couldn't possibly be merged by FY23, the 22-23 school year. The process of merging would take longer than that. That's why phase one, which happens in 22-23, is the repurposing to create those structures and realize the savings in ways that we can control. And then phase two would be the following year, would be the merger, which would bring additional savings, which would really impact the program offerings and sustainability at the secondary level, while also realizing a lot of savings to help sustain everything that we will have put together. And this slide is trying to show more or less how sustainable with the merger phase one and phase two would make us.
Patrick, this is Rob. I guess I'm still trying to wrap my head around what a third grader from Starksboro, if they were to decide to go to these innovative hubs, what does that look like tangibly on the ground, like on a Monday afternoon? What's going on in that building?
Yeah, so here's the trick, right? If I had this all figured out right now and said, this is what it will be, it is not co-created. I have ideas, I have thoughts, I could share what my thinking is, and it would be only that, my thinking, and I wouldn't want to get in the way of the co-creation process. Part of the value here is with some inspiration, thinking about Most Likely to Succeed, the book or the video and the little clip that we saw, I'd rather inspire people to co-create something that is hands-on, experiential, project or performance-based, that kind of an experience, rather than, sit alone in my office and make up what I think it's going to be and say, this is what's happening. I put some numbers to it, I put some people to it, gave it something that I think is reasonable to begin to work from. And then it's about creating some inspiration, a little bit of getting out of the way, and again, working to co-create with our community, with our students, with our staff, something that we think is going to be really remarkable. So I can't, because that's the idea, I can't tell you exactly today what that co-creation process will produce. And I don't think it's the best course of action to say this is what it would produce. Something different, something that we all wish school could be, right? When I look at that video, I see kids with their head down. I see kids disinterested in what's happening in their school. I don't want school to be something that kids have to sort of get through. I want school to be something that's exciting, that they can't wait to go to, that they get to create something, and they work closely with their community. That's sort of the idea. That's the vision, much as that video captured. How we get there, there's a whole lot of different paths we can take, and I don't want to predetermine what that path is. And you mentioned sort of if a kid chose to, I don't know that it's necessarily something that would work that way. It may be, instead of being something that a student gets to choose to do or not, it may be something that we decide is a worthwhile experience for every student, and we're going to make sure they get access to it. So I think about Bristol folks, this may make sense for us. I'm thinking about, gosh, I'm drawing a blank. Katrina, help me out. What's the Starbase, right? So I'm thinking about Starbase is a program whereby students, at least at Bristol Elementary, there may be others, get to work pretty intensively for shorter stints of time with folks at this place called Starbase. And they build rockets and they understand rocketry, and they get to fly their rockets. That kind of hands-on experiential project or performance-based kind of experience is kind of the mental model that we want to offer all students. And how we do it, when we do it, we need to get figured out. Exactly what it looks like, we need to get it figured out. And ideally, there's a lot of student voice and student involvement in deciding the what, in terms of, is it environmental? Is it performing arts? Is it STEM? Is it humanities? So again, I can't give you more than that really at this point.
Patrick, but I'm a little confused. So these innovation sites, and I'm sorry if you've already said this and I missed it.
Okay.
These innovation sites are not going to be operational as town schools, meaning, and this kind of speaks to my earlier question, is which students do these serve? I was assuming Mount Abraham Unified School District students, but Lincoln Elementary K through 5 in phase 1 of this recommendation would go to either Bristol or Moncton. Is that right?
Correct.
Right.
Same would be true for Beeman and for Robinson.
Patrick?
Yeah.
And to follow on that, so that year when that commences, is the idea that at the same time, these programs would also begin, these innovative programs.
Correct. So that FY23 school year, so the budget that we'll be building next year at this time would reflect phase 1.
Patrick, what do you anticipate, or have you modeled construction costs necessary to accomplish this transition? Of course, we have $1 million a year in the budget, which we know is always well spoken for. We'd heard at one point about repurposing necessary to support grades 6 through 12 at Mount Abe. I'm also wondering about the increased capacities, just if there's anything anticipated that you think would be sufficient to, for example, require a construction bond of any size.
No, I don't think there would be any construction needs of that scale to make this happen. I mean, the needs at Mount Abe remain, and we are chipping away at those with that $1 million that we have in the budget, which is why it's usually pretty well spoken for. But the utilization of the other buildings, yeah, I don't think it's a problem to bring all of our elementary students into 2 buildings effectively. That doesn't require any construction costs, and there'd be some upfit costs for moving central office into the Beeman building. I don't know exactly what those costs are, but again, they'd be well within the money we have budgeted to make that happen. So there isn't a construction aspect to this other than the needs we know already exist at Mount Abe that I think is a barrier to making this happen. And the reality is, I think we all have agreed that in the long run, continuing to pay rent for central office space is not a great idea. And wherever we move central office, if it's into one of our buildings, which I think makes sense because we have the space, there are going to be those upfit costs. So any scenario would have us with some upfit cost to make that happen.
But not upfit costs that would exceed an annual budget.
No.
Just one other thing is I'm wondering about with the projected numbers. So of course, this year in the state formula, there's a kind of reprieve from the ADM, but are you assuming that we catch up on that and that the sort of trajectories of student population decline that we've seen for the past 5 years will carry forward for the next 5 years in a relatively straight line? Is that kind of baked into these projections through 26?
Yeah, so what's baked into the projections are really the NESDEC enrollment projections. So we kind of worked backwards from NESDEC, plugged in their enrollment figures into the equalized pupil formula, and that produced our projected equalized pupil counts, which then we used that in our projected spending going forward to figure out what our cost per pupil would be and how far over or under the threshold we would end up. So that is baked into it. And so I think part of your question was, there's a statement that yes, we did get a bit of a reprieve as we build FY22 because of the hold harmless on ADM. And so instead of losing 20 something equalized pupil, we're projecting losing 3 or 4 equalized pupil. That's sort of how that reprieve kind of lands on the ground for us, at least based on our projections. We don't actually have our equalized pupil count in yet. And we do believe it's true, and we are anticipating that for FY23, which is what we'll be building next year, the actual loss of equalized pupil from this year for FY22 will be added to what would have been the loss going into 23 as well. So we do think we're going to have that catch up factor as we build FY23, which is part of why our FY23 picture looks pretty grim right now. And that's part of the motivation to make this change by that time. Otherwise, we're looking at, $3 or $4 or more million in savings that we have to find just for 23.
And so just as a thank you for that, and I would just say it seems that baked into any of this working, we have to assume that participation in our district with the new school configuration really has to be just as good as it would have been with the status quo, right? Like we can't afford for this transition to precipitate a drop in participation and attendance.
Agreed. We definitely can't afford to lose more students than we're already projecting to lose. The hope is we can build something great that becomes appealing, and we can keep our financial situation under control enough that we don't create a deterrent for people to stay or move to this area because taxes are so outrageous. And if we can maintain taxes at a reasonable rate and create some innovative programming that may be sort of unique to us, perhaps that's inspiration for people to move here rather than leave here. I think as we're going to start getting into some of the alternate possibilities that I have some information on, which I think will help put this idea in perspective when compared to some of the other possibilities that have been discussed.
Patrick, is that going to also, that comparison, lay out a little bit of what the potential staffing reductions might be in either scenario?
More than a little bit, yes.
All right.
Patrick, it's Andrew.
Yeah, go ahead, Andrew.
A question about phase 1 financials under the spending threshold, as I recall, on the other slide is by $5.5 million or so.
Were you in 23 or 26 that you're thinking of?
I think I was out in 23.
Yeah, so again, depending on, so without any of the possibilities that could happen, without any of those shaded boxes, in 23, without the weighting study, which I think
it's 2.1.
2 point, right. So, right. Before the addition of the program, the innovative programming.
So most of that savings, I'm guessing, is achieved through staffing reductions that follow the trend of enrollment decline and also closure of central office and putting that in Beeman. Is there something else that's a large percentage of that 2.1 million?
This is primarily driven by personnel. There are some, I think there's probably the combination of the operational costs of 2 buildings and the savings from not renting space for central office combined to about $300,000. I didn't realize any savings from operational costs at Beaman because the building would still be utilized. So there's 300,000 of that is savings from the actual reduced cost of operating buildings. Those costs for Lincoln and Robinson, that 240,000, is built back into the cost of the innovative program. So that is reflected here, but it's reflected in that program, the cost to operate that program. So that 5.5 million is, 5 million of that is personnel savings that can be realized while maintaining or actually increasing programs for students by bringing students in under 2 roofs instead of 5 at the elementary level.
Hi, Patrick, it's Kristen. So I have a bunch of questions, but it sounds like you might be going to at least address some of them in the rest of your presentation. So I'm not going to ask them, but I know there's a lot of good questions on the chat and on the Q&A. So you're gonna leave time for some questions today, and then at the other meetings next week.
So as I understand it from what Don led in with at the meeting, is tonight's really about questions and answers for the board. And there'll be an opportunity for public comment following this for the community, but it won't be necessarily a Q&A tonight for the community at the end. But the questions that are being generated tonight are going to be captured, I believe, and they'll help inform the community events that are next week on, I think, the 16th and 17th, where there'll be more Q&A for the community. Don, did I get that right?
Yes, that's the way I understood it. And Krista, I would just ask, do you know who's capturing the questions currently?
Yeah, Jennifer and I are working on it right now. Krista got started and we're picking it up.
Great. So the questions are being captured.
Yep, and I also just put in a plug for an email address for folks to send additional questions as well, beyond just the chat. And that is facilities.planning.questions@mausd.org.
Krista, is that on the website where somebody can find it?
Yes.
Okay.
And Don, another process question. Oh, sorry, Kristen. Is this our opportunity, this meeting, for the board to converse about this proposal? Because the fact that we've gone from the plan, which did not mention repurposing, to now the board is going to be given that responsibility. I think it's very important that we have ample time to talk about this before we have to bring it to a vote.
Yeah, it's not planned that we're going to discuss it tonight because we're going to be gathering more information through the events next week and the survey. And then once we have all that information, it's my understanding that that's the time we would discuss all of the information that we've gathered.
And so hypothetical, sorry, Krista had put out the timeline. So hypothetical, when would we have to move on some kind of a decision of some sort? I forget, is that January?
If the decision includes putting something on a ballot for town meeting day, then January is the timeline.
Is it possible for us to allow Patrick to finish before we dive into some of these process details?
Certainly.
I just think it's important. Sorry, I just think it's important for the people watching to know what the process is, because this is, we've all knew this would be a big day with some big information, and everyone's breath is taken away. Mine is, So I just think that's important too, to let the people that are listening, because we're not in the same room, know what is happening.
Krista will be sharing that timeline just before public comment, so people have a chance to look at it. But we're gonna just let Patrick finish and then move on.
So I have I guess, more comments than I do questions. I have long advocated for changing how we do education, and I admire your courage in putting such a comprehensive idea forward. I have my own reservations, and I think there'll be pushback from lots of different parts of the different communities and different interest groups and stakeholders in this whole process that we will need to work through with thoughtfulness and courage, I think. Myself, I am somewhat concerned about putting sixth graders over at Mount Abe. I wonder, I think there might be legislative and legal issues about moving pre-K into New Haven. And I am, and also with reducing sped spending right now, there are state and federal legal requirements we have to meet. So I'm not sure how we get much reduction in sped spending. And I'm very concerned about an additional administrative merger when I don't believe we've seen positive results from the Act 46 mergers to date, although this development that you put forward, Patrick, is a very exciting possibility going forward. Thank you.
So let me share a few of the sort of alternate possibilities that I think are important for consideration, and I think help provide some basis of comparison for some of the different options. And as we've talked about in other meetings, the reality is there are any number of possibilities on how we can move this forward. My goal tonight is not to disprove every idea that's out there. My goal is to, again, share with you my thinking that's evolved over the past 18 months, present to you what I think is a reasonable approach forward that is fiscally responsible and programmatically responsible and oriented toward improving outcomes for students. But let's take a look at some of the other possibilities that I think are worth the board knowing about. And really, again, so I had probably, I don't know, 10 or 12 variations of all of these things that I tried to put together in some sort of a more streamlined, organized fashion that I think people can wrap their heads around a little bit better. And really the three alternates that I'm going to share information on tonight are keeping schools and staffing as they are, and we let taxes increase to support that. And I'll try to demonstrate what that would look like. Keep schools and taxes effectively as they are and reduce staffing to make that happen. And then I'll share a school closure scenario different from repurposing. Very similar, agreed, but different. So as we saw earlier, so let's take a look at this first one, which is where we utilize schools as we do now and raise taxes to support the current staffing levels. As we saw earlier, if we keep the same staffing levels that we have budgeted for the current year, we can expect to pay between $7.3 million and $8.7 million in tax penalties in FY26 alone. This would cause taxes to increase by anywhere from 74 to 89% by FY26. That's 74 to 89% over what they are currently set at. This, I should also mention, this is all before the very recent announcement of the 9% increase in the tax rate for education next year, which, as I understand it, is effectively 1/3 to make up for some issue with the state teachers retirement system. About 1/3 of it is related to the sort of COVID economy, and about 1/3 of it is related to the projected increase in spending in schools. So this does not account for that. But as you can see, really steep increases in the tax rate for folks that are paying based on their home's value. So on a home valued at $200,000, we're looking at an increase of anywhere from about $2,500 to $3,000 from where they are now to FY26. And that's just for the education portion of taxes. That doesn't include any of the municipal town taxes. As you can see here, if we kept the spending at the spending threshold, we would expect to see education taxes increase approximately 11%. I thought it was important to know what we project will happen to the taxes if we stayed at the spending threshold compared to what happens if we don't in both the weighting study and non-weighting study scenarios. And again, this is before that 9% announcement that recently came out. As has been discussed at times here before, it's important to note that about 2/3 of Vermonters don't pay property taxes based on the value of their home, but rather on their income. Most recent data that we could get on the median household income in Vermont shows a median household income of just over $65,000 in 2018. If we use this level of income, education taxes are currently $1,823. Using the same spending information as we did for the other example, we could expect to see this increase by as much as 70 to 83% when we factor in the weighting study. That's an increase of as much as almost $1,300 to over $1,500. If we keep spending at the spending threshold, we might expect to see this increase by about 8% by FY26. When we look at household incomes that are 25% under and 25% over this spending threshold, we see that the percent increase remains steady. What's not reflected here is any increase in rent that may be paid as a result of the increased property taxes experienced by landlords. That would be an additional increase in cost of living for those folks that pay taxes based on their income sensitized level and pay rent. Now, as we think about this option of letting taxes increase to support what we have currently, I believe one of two things would be likely to happen. I believe either one, taxpayers won't pass a budget that has such a large tax increase, and the result of that then is we cut positions without some plan. Option two is taxpayers will pass budgets with those large tax increases. The cost of living then goes up really high, and that causes residents to possibly leave and may deter people from moving to our area. So another alternate for consideration was keep schools and taxes as we've come to know them and reduce staffing. And I think what we'll experience here is even if the taxes stay somewhere around what we've grown accustomed to, which is many would argue is already too high, our schools will not look really anything like they do now under this circumstance. So let's take a look at that a little more closely in just a second here. So if we chose to keep spending at the spending threshold to avoid tax penalties and achieve savings through staff reductions alone, while using our buildings essentially as we do now, we'd be looking at many staff reductions over the next 5 years without the benefit of creating efficiencies in staffing. If we need to reduce spending by about $7.3 million in FY26, and it all comes from staffing, we can expect to cut 75 positions. That's more than a 25% reduction in staff.
Patrick, do you have a rough number for what the associated reduction in student population would be in 2026? So it's a 27% reduction of staff. Do we have a projection of how much our EQP may have gone down by then, just for some comparison?
I don't have that right in front of me, but I would say it's far less than 27%. So a 27% reduction in equalized pupil would be, gosh, over 300 equalized pupils. And we will not lose 300 equalized pupils in the next 5 years, I don't believe. And I would say that even with the 6% decrease as a result of the weighting study. So I would say this is, and again, so we're kind of moved on to 26 here now with the weighting study. But in the prior slide, I would say this is disproportionate. This is a disproportionate reduction in staff to the reduction in students. So again, that's no weighting study. 75 positions. With the waiting study, this increases to 91 positions. That's about a third of our current workforce. And that's because we have to realize $8.7 million in savings by 26 with the waiting study factored in. When you see this level of reduction without some accompanying restructuring to create efficiencies, it's not hard to imagine the impact this will have on the supports and the services that we provide our students. And again, I do want to acknowledge that with or without merging or repurposing or closing schools, the bulk of the savings that we need to find are going to come from staff. Staffing makes up 75% of our budget, so there's no way we find significant savings without having staffing implications. However, bringing our students together into fewer buildings combined with the efficiencies we'd realize in merging with ADS Northwest would allow us to reduce the staffing that we need to while preserving and likely expanding supports and services for students. So
what would be the reduction of central office staff? I don't see that in this list.
So in a merger situation, we would effectively be reducing central office staff by nearly half of what is currently combined as 2 central offices. So that would be significant. Without a merger, the central office staffing levels couldn't reduce tremendously because we still have key positions that we have to hold to be able to operate our school system. There'd be some, but they're relatively minimal, comparatively speaking. They're in the areas of there'd be fewer coordinators, fewer, thinking about some of the other support positions there, but there are a number of positions. The vast majority of positions are essential to the functioning of the organization and couldn't be reduced.
Patrick, what are the staffing reductions anticipated for your recommendation, phase 1 and phase 2?
So I'm going to actually get into that a little bit. I'm going to show you what staffing we might have and how that looks and feels like in our, well, you're talking about in phase 1 or phase 2?
Phase 1 and phase 2.
Can you ask your question again?
Yeah, we're looking at staffing reductions anticipated if we, given this alternative scenario. I'm asking for the staffing reductions anticipated that go along with your recommendations for phase 1 of repurposing 3 of the elementary schools. And then moving on, what staffing reductions would look like if we did merge it for phase 2.
Sure. So I don't have those figures in front of me, but I will say they are comparable to this. So there's still significant staffing reductions in phase 1 and in phase 2. Phase 1, those reductions are primarily at the elementary level, in part because we're adding close to 100 students to the secondary level. And because we would be creating some new structures at the elementary level that can afford us the saving of positions without impacting programs for students. In phase 2, the efficiencies would come from central office and the secondary level, so middle and high school. And though the combination of phase 1 and phase 2, the reductions are fairly close to this. Again, without the specific number in front of me, I can't tell you, but we have the operational cost of the facilities, maybe if it's a school closure, but if we're repurposing in phase 1 and phase 2, we still maintain those costs. So the savings that we're talking about, that $5.5 million, and then the $2+ million from the merger, those are primarily from personnel, almost exclusively from personnel, in creating those efficiencies. And that's what makes the number pretty close to the same in either scenario. It's just that in one scenario, we've created some efficiencies so that we minimize the impact on students. And in another scenario, we don't take advantage of efficiencies, and momentarily we'll start to see what that impact on students could be. And I thought, to help everyone kind of understand what might the impact of these positional reductions be in a scenario where we didn't create some other efficiencies or take advantage of some restructuring in some way, I thought trying to sort of do a virtual tour of each of our elementary schools in particular right now would be useful, so we can all put our hats on. You know, probably everyone on here has been into at least one of our elementary schools, maybe more, but most people tend to be more familiar with one because it's in the town where they live. So I thought it was important to walk through each. So let's imagine that we are taking a tour of our schools 5 years from now. And I want to walk you through each of the buildings and help you understand what it might look like and feel like after we've cut 91 positions. So this assumes 5 years out, we didn't make some of the other decisions about restructuring, the waiting study happened, etc. And so you're going to see in here some speculation about how many FTEs by position in each building. They're there to help paint the picture of what it could be like in our schools. But please know this is nothing that's been decided. Nobody's been notified about any potential job action. We're looking 5 years out with many variables. This is simply to help us all understand where we might be headed if we don't take a different path. And this color code will help you visualize the utilization of each of our buildings. So you saw earlier a lot of green and maybe a little bit of orange as I was walking you through Bristol and Moncton in phase 1. So I want to articulate what these colors are. There's actually, I'm realizing now there's a color not here. There's orange, which is vacant, and you're going to see it'll say vacant in there, so it'll be really self-explanatory. But the FTEs may not necessarily resonate with a lot of people. 1.0 means that person's fully employed and that space would be expected to be utilized 5 days a week. Basically, every 0.2 FTE equals 1 day. So you're going to see some 0.8 in yellow, represents 4 days a week. Darker yellow, 0.7, 3.5 days. Blue is a 0.5 FTE. That sort of burnt sienna, maybe we'll call that. 2 days a week. That sort of pinkish kind of salmon color, a day and a half. Gray is a day. And that brownish color is a half day. And some of these are labeled, some of the cells were too small, but you'll get an idea of the utilization of each of the schools. So we're going to walk through schools. We're going to go alphabetically. So we're going to start with Beeman. So as we look at Beeman, you're going to notice the main floor where the front office is going to look and sound a lot like it might today, except the nurse is only going to be present 1 day a week and the principal would be there about 2.5 days a week. However, when you walk downstairs or upstairs, most days you wouldn't find anyone there. In addition to reduced access to a nurse, students would have reduced access to a guidance counselor and a librarian. Also, there'd be no support from a behavior assistant. Kindergarten classrooms would be without an assistant. Or in this case, it could be a K1 class or even a K1-2 class, depending on the numbers. They would be without an assistant. All this while class sizes would increase to 25 per class. Unfortunately, students would still have access to PE, art, and music. It would be a similar story in Bristol. Depending on the day, once you leave B wing and start down C wing, down to D wing, the only people you might encounter would be in the nurse's office, in the kitchen. Like at Beeman, students would have reduced access to a nurse and to a guidance counselor, as well as the librarian, and less behavior support. Kindergarten classrooms would be without an assistant. Class sizes would be around 24. And I neglected to mention this on the Beeman slide. I can go back, but I tried to give you a sense of how many students we're projecting for that year, working backward from the NESDEC sort of district projection. And I'm showing the average class size as well as the capacity as indicated by NESDEC. And with the projected enrollment, what the percent capacity is in each of our schools. So you can see in this scenario, Beeman would be at about 39% capacity. Bristol would be at about 57% capacity. Now we're at Lincoln. So at Lincoln, you'd be greeted by the admin assistant, as you may normally be now. The principal may or may not be there because they're only half time. Most days there'd be no activity in the gym. In fact, depending on the day, the only place you might find anyone would be in one of these 3 classrooms. All the other rooms would be empty or would be occupied between half a day a week and 1 day a week. Like the other schools, students would have reduced access to the nurse, guidance counselor, and librarian. There would also be no behavior assistant or kindergarten classroom assistant, or in this case, K1, or again, possibly K1-2 classroom assistant. Class sizes would average about 23. And this has Lincoln at about 43% capacity, looking at the NSDEC capacity figures. And you're probably starting to see the pattern now. As we walk through Moncton, again, the admin assistant will be there to greet you. But as you walk in the building, all of the rooms down the hall to your left are empty all week or nearly all week. Once you get past the gym, as you make your way down the hall to your right, you begin to encounter students and staff. As you might have guessed, students would have reduced access to the nurse, guidance counselor, and librarian. There'd also be no behavior assistant or kindergarten classroom assistant. Class sizes would average about 22. And it's more of the same at Robinson. Once you're past the main office, the entire building to your left is empty most of the time. Down the hall to your right, you would encounter the 4 classrooms. Once again, students would have reduced access to the nurse, guidance counselor, behavior assistant, and librarian. There would also be no assistant in the kindergarten or K1 classroom. Class sizes would average about 24 students. So in alternate possibility 3, we would operate 2 K-5 elementary schools at Bristol and Moncton, much like we did in the recommendation that I made. And again, like the recommendation, we would move 6th graders to Mount Abe, and we repurpose Beeman as an enhanced pre-K, childcare, and central office. In addition, in this scenario, we would ask residents of Starksboro and Lincoln to close their town schools and act to merge with Addison Northwest. The primary difference between this option and the recommendation I'm making is obviously the vote for school closure, and this does not include the sort of innovation sites that we had talked about, really acting as sort of the spark for a shift in our approach to educating students. In this closed schools scenario, Bristol looks really just like it did in my recommendation. So we're looking at about the same number of students, average class size, capacity. And likewise, in Moncton, looks a lot like my recommendation did. And again, from a programming perspective, this would allow students access to full-time nurse, full-time counselors, sufficient special areas teachers, special educators, interventionists, etc. When we look at the school closure possibility, we see that with a merger, we can expect to be able to stay at the spending threshold whether or not some of the other factors happen in our favor. And we would be well under the spending threshold, as much as $1 to $2 million if these factors do fall our way. And it appears to keep us financially viable for the foreseeable future. School closure without a merger would fall about $2.5 million short of getting us down to the spending threshold. If all of the other factors went our way, then we would be just about at the spending threshold. I think it's likely that some of those could go our way. I think it's unlikely that all of those things happen. So really, even the school closure scenario without a merger falls short. So I want to just highlight now sort of a reminder about decision-making from this point going forward. I think it's important to remember what the community authority is, what the board authority is, and what the superintendent authority is. The schools, the towns, community authority is the town where the school sits has to vote to close a school. 5-town electorate gets to approve the budget that the board puts forward, and the 5-town electorate would have to approve a merger with Addis Northwest. The MAUSD board authority would be to determine what to ask the community to vote on. They do have the authority to repurpose schools. They have the authority to determine what budget amount to put before voters, and they get to decide whether or not to form a merger study committee. As superintendent, my authority is how to spend the money that gets approved by voters, with some parameters set by policy focused on achieving the ends without violating the executive limitations that are set out in policy. And lastly, I think just thinking about some of the next steps, I think this is part of the process we were talking about, something that Kristen was getting at earlier. Tonight, I've made my recommendation, and the board has had and will continue to have an opportunity for sort of conversation with me, asking me questions. Next week on the 16th and 17th, there are community informational meetings where we can have more of a Q&A with the community and try to respond to some of the questions that maybe are surfacing tonight. And coming forward soon, Krista may have more details on this. There's going to be an opportunity to complete the Community Engagement Committee survey that's really kind of specific to my recommendation tonight. In January, the board's going to review those survey results. And ultimately, by the end of January, the board has to decide what, if anything, is put on a town meeting day ballot. Following that, there's sure to be more community engagement in February leading up to March if we're looking at a town meeting day vote. And then in March, if there is a vote needed, that's when the community would have its chance to act on whatever's put forth before them. And that's the end of tonight's presentation. So I think I'll stop sharing, but I can always reshare to go back to some slides if people have questions that I can go to.
Patrick?
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the advantages of having, not just from a cost perspective, but are there advantages to having all of our students in 2 elementary schools? In other words, does that mean that behavioral support specialists can be concentrated more in one area than more thinly across 5 schools, for example? Or I'm thinking mostly about intervention supports and how that might differ when you have students in 2 versus 5 elementary schools.
Yeah, I mean, I think you essentially hit the nail on the head in terms of the benefit of having students under fewer roofs. It'd be different if we had schools that were more fully populated by students, because then we could realize some efficiencies still. But in the absence of that, we do struggle with those efficiencies, and we do spread thin the resources that we have. And as a result, we don't get the outcomes that we'd like to see from those. I'll give an example. This is a conversation that just surfaced today. Our interventionists do amazing work in supporting, in particular, struggling readers and struggling mathematicians. And in our small schools, which are getting smaller, it's difficult to have oftentimes more than maybe one student working with that interventionist, because it's really important that as they're doing that really targeted work, that the students in a group have similar needs for that targeted work to be effective. If you group kids with widely ranging needs that you're trying to do some targeted intervention with, it becomes diluted and you don't see the kinds of results. The challenge then that we face is during the third grade win time at a particular school, there may only be one student with a particular profile that the interventionist can really work effectively with. So we end up having one interventionist working with one student, which is great for that student, but creates some inefficiencies from a personnel perspective. Whereas if we went the other extreme, if all of our students were under one roof, the likelihood of more than one third grader having a similar profile, being able to work together in a group, that the collaboration that could happen is advantageous. And now that same 1.0 FTE is working with 2 or 3 students, and you've created tremendous efficiencies without any sacrifice to the support that's being offered to the students. So that's an example, a pretty specific example of exactly that idea of when we spread thin, we have inefficiencies. And that's why when you scale that up to the entire district, when we put kids under fewer roofs and we can realize those kinds of efficiencies, we are able to reduce staff and still meet student needs, perhaps even better meet student needs than we can now, and certainly than we could going forward with lots and lots of staffing reductions, but no structural change.
Patrick, has there been any discussion with Addison Northwest on this up to this point? I know they're meeting tomorrow to talk about the same topic.
They are. Yeah, there's been some discussion. So I've been in conversation with their superintendents. We've had, and I think this is fair to disclose, we've had, so Dawn as chair, myself as superintendent, Krista as chair of the community engagement committee, and Kevin as chair of the facilities committee, have met a couple of times, not too frequently, with effectively the same sort of people holding the same positions in their district, really thinking about, at the very least, we're going through a very similar process with the very same challenge. What can we do to support one another and learn from one another as we do this work in parallel? And as the idea grew more and more about the possibility of a merger, which grew pretty organically for us, I can't speak to how it has evolved in Addison Northwest, that has created opportunities for conversation about what do we think? Where do we go from here? So I know they're thinking about it, talking about it, and we'll see where they ultimately land. But there has been some ongoing conversation as we've all been navigating this same work.
Are they also looking at repurposing or closing one of their schools? I mean, your scenario didn't seem to point to that. But.
No, it didn't point to that, in part because I don't think it would be my place to point to that, and in part because they already have done that, right? So they have far fewer buildings than we have to begin with, so their options are more limited. But Addison Central School last year, I think it was last year, was an elementary school, K through 6. This year, it is not an elementary school. Those students are all, I believe, in Virgin's elementary school. And the Addison Central School is now the Addison Wayfinder Experience, which is that alternative program for students in grades 7 through 12. So they've done some of this already. And that leaves them with currently 2 elementary schools and a middle high school. So there's not a lot of added room for reconfiguration for them. Whereas we have, several more buildings, and that creates more opportunity and understandably more challenge as well as we figure out what to do with that. Yeah, Dave, go ahead. You want me to call on people, Don, or do you want to do that?
So your comments about the interventionist and how that would work differently really hits a nail on the head from my perspective. We need to decide what we're going to do before we decide where we're going to do it. And I think that that's implicit in the questions that we've heard so far with regard to what's going to happen in Starksboro and Lincoln schools. What are these innovative programs going to be?
And Rob had his hand up too.
Yeah. And what do transportation costs look like in a budget going forward with the repurposing and then with the merger?
So the transportation costs and the repurposing won't be a substantial difference. I've been in conversation with our bus company to talk that through. And, you know, they said it's effectively the same number of buses. They're running effectively the same routes. Those buses almost all come back into Bristol Village anyway. So the transportation costs in the phase one reconfiguration aren't a significant difference from what they would be now. In the merger, those costs could be different. You know, we would be sending students. Right now, we send a bus daily from Mount Abe to Middlebury. We'd be looking at sending some buses daily still to Middlebury for the Career Center, but also out to Virgins for middle or high school. In the example I gave, it was middle school. But those increased costs, again, would be insignificant relative to the savings that we'd realize, and more importantly, the program preservation and expansion that we would see. But there would be some added cost. I don't think it would be a significant driver.
On that same note, I'm just curious, was it looked at in terms of utilization of transportation services? I'm just thinking about Starksboro, where I represent. We've got 3 parks in town that are one right next to the elementary school. I'm thinking about miles driven and transportation options based on towns. And I'm just wondering if some of that was modeled into this. In other words, are there discrepancies between utilization of bus services in towns now? And was that data considered in this recommendation?
So the reality is, in both of these scenarios, for sure in a merger scenario, but even likely in our repurposing scenario, we would want to look more holistically at our transportation routes. Right now, they're pretty well defined because they go, you know, from lots of points in one town to one point in that same town. With, in most cases, there are multiple buses, 2, 3, 4 buses running in each town. They meet at a particular point, and then the kids that go from that elementary school to Mount Abe kind of hop on the same bus and they consolidate and get to Mount Abe that way. Both of these would require us looking a little differently. So more holistically as a district in the phase one sort of reconfiguration, which probably would allow us to take advantage of some efficiencies. Right now, we could probably take advantage of a couple of efficiencies in a couple of towns already. So those efficiencies, I think, even if they don't save us money, we may be able to redistribute some of those buses beyond what we need now to help keep the transportation time for our students down. I think the goal, which is achievable, and again, in the reconfiguration scenario, I've talked this through some with our bus company. The goal would be to keep kids, even though they're going to school in a different town perhaps than where they are now, the goal would be to keep them on a bus for no longer than what is expected right now. You know, our target right now is 45 minutes on a bus. And really that's achievable. The question is, how many buses does it take and what are the routes that they run and what are the associated costs? And again, we're not anticipating it being a significant increase in cost. It may just mean taking a different look at the transportation routes. Again, in a merger, I think to be able to look across both school districts at transportation and take advantage of routes would be something we'd want to really consider. Now, as we think about, you know, middle schoolers leaving Bristol to head to Virgins, if they go out, you know, 17 and take Green Street, they could pick up a bunch of middle schoolers on their way to the middle school. So there are definitely, we would want to study that closely. That might be part of what the merger study committee would want to look at. And we could commission a transportation study in that way. But again, we can mitigate the amount of time kids spend on buses by figuring out how many buses we want to run and what we can afford and what those pros and cons end up being. Transportation is not a barrier here. It's something we just have to figure out.
How about a word from Hannah?
Hi, to anybody who doesn't know me, I'm Hannah and I'm a freshman and I'm a school board representative for a community council. And I was just wondering if there's any way that we could get student input on this process. Because as like a high schooler who will be graduating in a few years, this might not affect me that much, but I think that it would be really important to get some student input on parts of this.
I completely agree. I think the plan is for students to be able to respond to the survey that's being created to provide that input.
Did you want to say
And Kristen.
So if I remember, because there's a lot to absorb, the middle school merger under this plan would happen the year after next, right, Patrick?
At the
And
earliest,
so-
and I acknowledge that's an aggressive timeline to merge that quickly. But I think as we, as Caleb raised before, we discussed some FY23, there's likely to be a pretty significant kind of financial cliff that if we can realize a merger for, that would be really helpful.
So if the sixth graders were to go up to what would be Mount Abe at that time, because the full merger wouldn't happen yet, in 2 years, that would need some planning. And I know Middlebury's been planning for their middle school. I don't know the exact timeline, but they paved out several years to do that. But this would just be a stopgap, because then eventually, if this entire plan were taken up, then the middle school would move to Virgins. So those kids might hop around a little bit. So what is the bandwidth right now with COVID and everything? I mean, maybe next year we won't be dealing with much of it, for the school district to do the planning for sixth graders going to to Mount Abe, and then for the innovation centers, because that would give you basically, well, whenever any decision is made, whether a decision is made to do this or not, that would give you next year in the summer after to do the planning for that. How is there a capacity to do that?
Yeah, I think from my perspective, people have a lot more capacity for co-creating something that is exciting and innovative than they do for figuring out how to salvage as much as possible while we lose dozens of positions. So I think our capacity to imagine something different now is greater than our capacity to absorb the reductions if we don't do something.
Sarah McLean.
Yeah, I want to start by just, saying that I think that the possibilities mindset rather than the deficit mindset is exciting, and thinking about innovation and focusing on that, making that a focus is very exciting. And it's so nice in this time to kind of frame what is a financial crisis into more of a positive, forward thinking view of our district. I love that way of thinking. I really appreciate that focus, and yet I can't really quite wrap my my mind around the motivation behind repurposing 3 of the schools, as opposed to just going with your third alternative, closing 3 of the schools, or repurposing New Haven and moving, the central office into New Haven. I'm just more curious on the motivation. For me, it's kind of almost seems like where it's a more palatable moment right now for the towns. It doesn't put it in their court. They don't have to vote on it. So it's also possibly a more possible outcome given phase 1. And it also buys us time on the aggressive timeline of consolidation. And so if those are 2 factors, which they very well may be, even if they're not the sole factors, it seems like the innovation centers, just for the sake of just like being as straight as we can, that innovation doesn't need to take place on 2 separate campuses. That innovation could also take place at Bristol, at Moncton, at Mount Abe. But the reasoning behind keeping Lincoln and Starksboro would be more to move phase 1 forward.
for me, it was more about thinking about, so trying to infuse something new into a structure that's existed for about 120 years is really challenging. Having a space separate from that structure that's existed for 120 years that can be designed to be what it is desired to be in every essence of that space, and the ability to have it look the way it's intended to look and function the way it's intended to function and have the intended results it's intended to have is much greater when it's separated from this other thing we're trying to transform. And in doing so, the potential is there to give a really more sort of authentic and genuine experience, to give that mental model of what could be, in the hopes that it would sort of transition into the structure that's existed for 120 years. While also, part of my thinking is with two different sites, I think to give every student the experience, and for some students, perhaps our secondary students, an opportunity to really dig in more intensively and to have the space where that can happen, I think leaves open some really great possibilities too, right? So it's one thing if younger students cycle through in some sort of rotation and get this experience, and then for those that it really resonates with and it takes off for, to be able to provide that more in-depth opportunity, at least to have that out there as an option with a separate location, is more the thinking for me behind the repurposing than anything else. And again, it really does stem from, I have next to no indication that there's an interest in our towns to close schools. And I don't see repurposing as a way to skirt that. And I'm sure some will make it out to be that. If I was trying to skirt that, I wouldn't highlight in this presentation that it can be perceived that we're actually trying to skirt this. I would probably not mention something about it. For me, it was, okay, towns don't want to do that with good reason. We have to do something that puts kids under fewer roofs, because you can see what happens if we don't. So what's something that maybe is somewhere in the middle that does give us this idea of how do we utilize these buildings as an asset rather than a liability? It's different. It's not the same as it was, but there would still be kids in those buildings practically every day. There'd still be opportunities for communities to join in what's going on in those schools, perhaps in a more deep, meaningful way than they happen now. Is that something that our community would respond well to? And if not well, maybe better than asking them to close a school. I don't really know. It seemed to me like a better alternative to asking towns to close their schools, when they've made it pretty clear to me in a couple of cases they're not willing to do that. I don't know if they're willing to do this or not, but we'll probably get a chance to hear.
Rob.
Oops. Where'd you go? Sorry. To that, Patrick, that's something that is just really churning in my gut right now. Is there's the agreement, and then there's the spirit of the agreement. And I think asking a town to vote to close its school is in the agreement, and repurposing, man, that's a real big gray area. And I see this come up in the chat. My question is, how much confidence do you have in those NASDAQ projections? What was their margin of error? And then also just considering, like, this is a pretty major change in a certain regards, in my opinion, to our school district. And with COVID, we have seen some in-migration to the state of Vermont. I guess, how solid are we feeling in those enrollment projection numbers?
I think as solid as we can be. So when I think about, hopefully she doesn't feel outed by this. So I question the same thing, working backward from the enrollment projections NESDEC gave us. I use that to sort of project the enrollment at each school. Lincoln was showing perhaps the most significant decline over the next couple of years, with their enrollment being at, and I showed it at 69 students in the 2015-2016 school year. Down from 2 years ago, they were 115 or 118 or something like that. So that's a really steep decline in 5 or 6 or 7 years. So I connected with Tori to just check in and say, so here's what NESDEC's saying, here's what I'm kind of looking at specific to Lincoln. I know you've been doing a lot of enrollment projections on your own. Does this jive with what you've been calculating? And she told me that she was projecting between 65 and 70. So from that perspective, yeah, I mean, I have as much confidence in those NESDEC figures as I would any other projection that we might have. I mean, this is what they do for a living. That's a big part of their organization. They make these projections for districts all throughout New England. They do hundreds of them every year. They looked really thoroughly at a lot of factors that you can see in their report. If we can't put some stock in their at least district level projections, then I don't know what we could put stock in. I think it is, I will also say, COVID has thrown a wrench into everything. Like that has an impact. It has an impact of out migration. It may have an impact of in migration. We're, even in the projections you see, we're assuming most, like the vast majority of the kids that are currently home studied come back. We don't know that's going to happen. We're making a projection that they will, but who really knows in the end what the impact will be there? And that's, that's directly related to COVID. I think we had, gosh, what do we have? Floyd, you might remember something like 50 more students, or maybe actually, I think it was 73 students enrolled in home study this year that were not enrolled in home study last year. I don't know how many of those folks are coming back. I hope most, and I hope all. But that's a decision that each family gets to make. And so right away, let's say none of them come back. We need 73 COVID in-migration students to make up for just the out-migration due to home study. So as much as we can put stock in any, I feel pretty confident what NESDEC has provided us.
Hannah?
I would just say, like, as a current student who, like, really enjoys hands-on type opportunities and, like, creative stuff, this sounds really amazing to me. I wish I could be a part of it, and I'm really excited if we do this for other kids to have a chance to do stuff like this, because it sounds really amazing to me to like have all these different like creative opportunities outside of your school classroom.
Thank you, Hannah, for sharing that. Steve.
So thinking about your Caleb's question about the staff reductions and its disproportionate relationship to the enrollment drop. And for me, that kind of points out the discrepancy between the rise that they allow in the spending threshold each year as compared to what we're seeing for actual cost increases, primarily the health insurance number. When we have no control over health spending anymore, we can't negotiate that locally. Not that we had a lot of control over it anyway, but when that's something completely outside of local spending control, and we're being asked to pay a penalty for exceeding a spending threshold, when that's the primary driver of increase in our salaries, which is the bulk of our spending, for me, there has to be some legislative push to disconnect that conversation. why is education paying the penalty for the broken healthcare system? And if we were able to at least make the spending threshold react to what we're seeing for healthcare increases, we'd at least be able to slow the impact of the increases and have more maneuvering room, on a year-to-year basis for reacting to some of these issues.
Yeah, I don't disagree. And I should add that when I talked with one of our local representatives recently about the effort to get the $1 million in construction services to not count against the spending threshold, he also mentioned that he was interested, and I think there was some growing interest in looking at not counting healthcare costs toward the spending threshold. In all reality, that probably means a change in the threshold. Like, they're not going to just take the healthcare costs away and keep the threshold where it is, because it is such a big figure. But at least to take a step toward exactly what you're describing, Steve. I don't know. Again, I don't know, how much activity that's going to get. There's kind of a lot. The legislature has a lot to tackle in this next remote session, and they're still reeling from COVID and everything else. But I know there's some interest in growing on that. I don't know if Caleb has any more of the inside scoop. But.
Well, I don't have an inside scoop, but I would just say maybe it's not the entire healthcare spending. Maybe it's just the year-over-year increase that you're exempt from in that particular year.
Yeah, that's pretty much what I'm suggesting, is that
half $1 million a year, so it's not nothing, and it does. When we get the number, it's just a question of how floored are you by it in that particular moment. Oops, sorry for the.
Well, when we're saying next year, they're tying it to the NEEP, and it's a point, whatever you said, % increase. That has no reality connection to the 9.8% in healthcare costs that are being tacked on to our salaries now. So it's a complete disconnect. But if we could at least pick up the increase in the spending threshold or some portion of it.
So I imagine everybody's head is still spinning with all the information that we got. And early on in this, when we started this meeting, somebody said this is probably a decision that we would wish we weren't faced with making. And I just feel the need to say that again. Like, I know that the other 12 people that sit on this board with me are not looking forward to deciding what to do. I know it's a challenge, and I think we'll struggle and we'll work through it, and we'll be listening to our community, today and next week and after that. And I really want to encourage the board members to listen in on the meetings next week, so you can hear more of what the community is asking, and set time aside to do that. We're coming in on the end of our time with this part of the meeting, and there are two on the speakers list that wish to make comments. One of them is from some students. They were not able to attend, so they made a little video. It was 2 students, so I am allowing them 2 minutes, and they did go a little over. Patrick, I sent you that video because I don't know how to share my screen, so I hope you got it.
Let me see.
Hello, my name is Bella Osborne.
Okay, I do have it, and I'll share my screen now.
My name is Bella Osborne. And my name is Elsa Macefield. We are in 5-6, and we go to LCS. We love it here. I'm going to be talking about today why LCS is so important to us. Habits of mind. At LCS, we have habits of mind. The teachers model and teach different types of learning and interactions with friends. A few of the habits of mind are finding humor, applying past knowledge, listening and responding with empathy and understanding, and managing impulsivity. It's good to know that the teachers are noticing when you make a good choice. No other schools do this as much as we do. LCS is a community. We have volunteers who come in for book groups and much more. A couple of examples are our yearly culture study. Every year, we study a different culture, and volunteers from all over Lincoln help with the different groups. We also have firemen from the Lincoln Fire Department who visit and teach us about fire safety. Every year, when it's not COVID times, an author visits and talks to all the students in our school. They also teach us about their craft. It's a valuable opportunity to have these experts and Lincoln community members work with us at our school. Book buddies are an exciting way for 5th and 6th graders to connect with the primary grades. On Halloween, in multi-age groups, we make masks and then walk over to the preschool to put on a mask parade. Having multi-age group events is important because in bigger schools, we feel like there might be kids in upper and lower grades that don't know each other. In LCS, we make a point to connect with our community. We can walk through the halls, and the younger kids will shout our names and tell us what they did at recess. There's a real connection between the kids in LCS. The environment. LCS is also special because of where it's located. We have a field, forest, and a river. At LCS, we have hike day in September. The whole school divides into 7 groups, and each group goes on a different hike. Sunset Ledge, Mount Abe, and Snake Mountain, for example. When you're in 5-6, you go to Lotus Lake, an outdoor education center where we practice team building, go on hikes, and do whole group cooking. Because of the pandemic, all classes have outdoor classrooms. The 5-6 classrooms are under giant tarps in the Hemlock Grove. When we're there, we're excited to learn. Right now, we are doing lots of learning by the river, which runs right through our school grounds. We think having all these experiences are important because we learn new things and have new experiences in the beautiful outdoor space. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for sharing with us. And then the other person on the speaker list is Herb Olson. Patrick, if you could promote him so we can see him, that would be great.
Actually, I think Katrina still has
Katrina,
host privileges.
You hear me, folks, now?
Yes, we can. If you have a camera and want to turn it on.
Yeah, I thought there was a video, but that's fine. A couple of thoughts. Thanks for letting me share here. The first comment is I hope the board will do everything they can to ensure that the financial data and other assumptions on which Patrick has formed certain conclusions and made his recommendation will be available to the public as soon as possible. I think that would be very helpful in terms of moving forward for those who really want to, understand better what the recommendation is about, and also whether there are any financially feasible alternatives. And we really sort of need the data in order to understand that. So I hope that's available. Thank you.
Thank you, Herb. Okay, so those were the two that that we posted about adding on the speaker list. So at this point, we will just move on to our next agenda item. And just a reminder to people that if you had a question and you didn't get it in the chat, there is that document you can find by visiting the website where you can get your questions added to the list. And then the events coming up next next week on the 16th at 9 a.m. and on the 17th at 6 p.m.
And Don, I'll share my presentation following this meeting, so we'll get that out.
Okay, great. Thank you. And then the recording, as soon as it's available, will be posted as well, if I remember correctly.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so now we'll head back to our agenda. Just gonna find it. Okay, and next is an action item to set a date for December's January budget engagement. And I think Krista was gonna bring, Krista, did we talk about that at community engagement, like a window of time, or was it looking more like January?
I think it was January, and we were going to ask Patrick what might work best, right?
Yeah, and we talked about doubling up meetings because there was a concern about having multiple meetings on deck in January. So could we, do a budget info session for the community and then have our board conversation about this process? So I don't think we've nailed on a date, but there are not that many. If we think about when we would need to warn a vote, I think that was the driving factor. So we were looking at like the third week in December, or January rather. I'm sorry, I don't have specific dates in front of me.
Right, I think we were going to rely on Patrick's availability as well.
So we're looking at the week of January 18th.
That sounds right.
You are in luck. I don't have any evening meetings scheduled that week right now.
So I just want to confirm again that what we agreed was that we would have a community budget info session. So presentation on the budget and an opportunity for the community to ask questions. And this is for the 21-22 budget. And then we would conclude that, and then we'd go into a board meeting, which would be solely focused on this topic. And we would be looking to decide whether we're going to adopt a recommendation and or put together language for a possible vote. So we would have the survey from the community, the data for that, in advance of that meeting.
Right. The idea there was if the first time the board's discussing what to put on the warning for a ballot is at their January meeting where that has to be decided and voted on and approved, that makes that January regularly scheduled board meeting pretty tricky to pull all of that off. So this meeting was in part to decide if there's going to be something put on a ballot, to at least generate sort of the concept, at least, of what's going to be put on the ballot so that we could get legal review before finalizing that at the regularly scheduled January meeting.
I'm just realizing we didn't share that map of sort of the timeline that you would have done, Krista.
Right, and I mean, if someone wants to give me the ability to share my screen, I can show that, although I think, well, it is a visual that's a little different than, but it has the same information, Patrick, that you put in the presentation for the next steps of the process. But if it would be helpful to see that visual, I'm happy to do that. It would just mean sharing my screen.
I think you can share. I just pressed it and I was able to. You might be able
that
to.
option at the bottom, Krista.
Oh, there we go. Okay.
Mom, I didn't realize that.
Okay. Oy, where did it go though? Hold on. I got to see where it went. Sorry, folks. Okay, can you see that? Is that diagram up, Don? Can you see?
There
Okay.
it is now.
Okay, right. So we're here on the 7th, and then this similar presentation will be delivered to the community next week at 2 different times. And it'll be the chance for the community to ask questions and make comments, as well as via email, and those questions and answers will be posted to the website. We'll be putting out a survey for the community in this window, but approximately the 16th of December through January 10th. Then there'll be analysis of the data from the survey, which is going to go to all 5 town residents. And that will be provided to the board before this meeting that we're talking about, which would be when we will look at the data and additional, the additional input from the community and decide what we want to do with this recommendation.
So is it necessary to, I'm sorry, just for some clarification, based on what Patrick just said, do we need to take some action tonight if we want to be on track for putting a vote to communities?
No, because we have until, I think, the 26th, or that we have until the end of January. So, so this time frame is to put out that survey, get feedback, the board will meet, and then we would have to make that decision at the end of January.
I think the only decision that is probably needed tonight is to pick the date where the conversation can happen, to kind of sketch out what the warning would want to be so that it can then get reviewed. Currently, we don't have time in for that conversation.
Right, and are you guys proposing that we combine the budget conversation with this conversation?
I'll comment on that, but would it be okay if I stop sharing my screen? Or do folks want me to keep that up? Okay. Yeah, so I think it was at the last board meeting that we talked about this, and I know I had concerns about combining those things, to be honest, because it's a really big topic. But I think the flip side was the numbers of meetings and our capacity for all board members to attend multiple meetings in 1 month. And so I thought the consensus at that time was to do both in one night.
I would rather split, but that's just one member.
Rob?
Me too.
My memory might be wrong, but I thought that was at our community engagement committee meeting. That we
Okay,
discussed
thank
that. So
you.
we made
Okay.
no formal board action in regards to 1 or 2 meetings. That's my memory.
I think you polled members, and it just seemed like the additional meetings for some of the community engagement people as well was a challenge.
Is it worth a show of hands now to see where people are?
Well, let's just clarify first. I think that would be helpful, but can we clarify first? So right now, the only thing on the books in January is our regularly scheduled board meeting.
On the 6th.
And the concern and reason why we were proposing having an additional meeting for this recommendation was so that if we were going to warn a vote, we would not try to have a really long discussion. We had enough time to have our conversation and to develop language for an article. So that became a second meeting. So then we were at January, week of the 18th. And then we discussed the need for a budget information meeting, and that got us to our third meeting. So I think the question on the table is we have 3 meeting needs for January. Is that right, Patrick, as far as you can see it? Okay.
Steve?
Yeah, the only point I wanted to add was I think there was at the last meeting, not the community engagement meeting, at the last board meeting, there was discussion about whether we needed another budget information meeting in December, which I think we agreed we didn't need. We didn't, I wasn't at a meeting where we discussed combining them, combining the second meeting, but I don't think we needed the meeting in December for the budget. So I'm personally in favor of combining them just because I think this year's budget discussion is fairly straightforward. I don't think it's complicated. I think it's because of the state's position on the, hold harmless for the student count. We're in fairly decent shape, and I don't think there's a lot of concern over it immediately. It's more of a concern for the following budget.
I agree that meeting could be combined with a discussion about what to put to voters. And I would like to discuss the option of putting to the 3 towns that would have their schools fundamentally repurposed. I would like to put the question of closure to those towns. I understand that the technical authority of the board in that regard, but I still feel it is appropriate to ask the question and get the answer.
So can we get a thumbs up for 1 meeting and then thumbs up for 2 meetings, and so we can sort of see where everybody is? So for 1 meeting in January.
So Don, this is 1 or 2 meetings in addition to the regular meeting, right?
Right. Right. So, all right. So 1 meeting. All right. Steve's he's gonna do 1 meeting or 2 meetings. What would you like? Oh. 1. Oh, there's a 2. I'm trying to wait.
So right now we're putting 2 fingers up if we prefer 2 meetings in addition to the regular board meeting, and 1 finger if we just want 1 to combine the budget and the facilities.
Correct. You put 3 up? 1, 2. So I see 2. Oh, wait.
Kevin, what are you doing?
I know Kevin's going to go either way.
I'll go either way. I don't care.
All right. So 1, 2. Kristen, what are you doing?
I don't care.
All right. Sarah, do you care? All right. 2, 3, and then 1, 2, 3. So we have 3 1s and 3 2s, and the rest don't care.
It's all up to you, Don.
Okay. I guess we're having 2 additional meetings to our regular board meeting. As much as I think it might tax us, we'll have to support each other through it.
And just think, if the budget meeting isn't complicated, we in and out, 30 minutes.
Liz, did you want to say something? Where did you go? I lost her.
I think that was Sarah demonstrating her love of thinking about possibilities and.
Oh, Liz. Oh, okay. All right. Okay, so now we'll find 2 dates. I guess if one's a really short meeting, we could do them both in the same week, huh? Okay, so we'll look at the calendar and then get back to you. So be prepared for that, probably in that week of Patrick's clear calendar to be, we're gonna fill it up for him.
Is there any reason not to do it now? Or pick the dates now?
Did we warn
January
them?
19, January 20?
I guess we did.
Krista, do you remember off the top of your head the nights of select board meetings?
No, I do have it written down somewhere. I could pull it up if you give me a minute.
Is there a reason why we couldn't do the board budget meeting the week before that? Or are we waiting on numbers or something?
Theoretically, we should have pretty solid numbers the week before that. And conceptually, the closer to the end of January we get, the more reliable those numbers are.
Wednesdays and Thursdays are pretty good from a select board standpoint. It's like first and third Mondays and second and fourth Tuesdays. So those days could work depending. But Wednesdays and Thursdays are clear.
So does that work for you, Patrick, the 20th and the 21st?
Yep.
All right.
That works better for me.
Okay.
And that's still enough time if we develop language to warn. Because I know it isn't just the deadline, right? You wanted to make sure legal counsel would have time to review it.
Yes, I think
that would be tight, but
I think we can put the squeeze on Dina a little bit. Should be okay with it. Maybe I might ask that we make the 20th the discussion about the warning. That just buys us one more day, and then the 21st could be the budget discussion for 22. And I can give Dina the heads up that this is coming so she'll know and can be anticipating it.
So is it the 21st? No, wait, 20th and 21st. Okay. Okay. All right. Okay.
You want to do 6 p.m. for each of those? Plan them for 6 to 8 or something like that? Or do you want to do 1 hour for the budget and then 2 hours for the long range planning?
Sure. I think that's a good idea. We'll plan 1 hour for the budget and 2 for the discussion.
The 20th is inauguration day.
Okay. Anybody by oh, Chris is still here. Chris, any chance you have the board evaluation up?
I have it up.
Oh, great. Thank you, Andrew.
What is the level of engagement of all board members, high or low? Thumbs up, thumbs down, thumbs up. Was the agenda followed, yes or no? Does the chair effectively establish the agenda and materials for distribution to the board? Is the chair effective in fostering a professional culture regarding fair and open deliberation, full participation of all members, and ensuring the integrity of the board process? Okay. Other feedback for the chair? All right.
I think it was very good that Don kind of gave a preamble to the presentation tonight to set the stage.
good introduction from Dawn to set the stage for tonight's facilities discussion. Okay, what went well with the meeting? Okay. No comment?
I just have one comment that as board members, we really have to work on staying out of that chat. It just could cause us some problems down the road that we could just avoid if we stayed out of the chat. I guess the best way to think about it is we wouldn't be sitting in a meeting together and then to have suddenly somebody stop paying attention to the meeting and have a side conversation. So we have to think about that as we are in the Zoom meetings.
Okay, so I put that in number 9. What suggestions do you have for ways to improve future meetings?
You could put it either place, wherever, just as long as we capture it so that we can work on it.
Okay.
Is there a way to disable chat?
Not in the webinar.
Okay. Is there anything else, suggestions for improvements?
I'm curious, Katrina, did you find the report section where you're able to download all the chat?
No, I couldn't find it. We did an old-fashioned photo.
Oh, jeez.
I hope she can read it. I think she can. She's having some technical difficulties also and can't be heard, but she's capturing everything.
I think it can also, I think it shows up in the recording as well. I know at least in the meeting version, it's there that we can find the chat recording. So we can look there once this recording's done.
Okay. Anything else you want in the survey? Rob?
Yeah, just to clarify from last board meeting, will the regularly scheduled board meeting at the end of the month be the one where we're going to be able to see all the participants up on screen? Were we going to change the format or not? Did I understand that wrong from our board meeting?
It was my understanding at some point that we heard something that can't happen in the Zoom meeting that we needed to have control of or something. So that's why we were going to just move people forward in the public comment period and then move them back. That's the way I remember it, but I can go back and re-listen to the video or go over it again to double check.
Yeah, I remember it in line with Rob's memory that we were going to figure out a new way to include attendees so that we could see each other. And there was concern of this meeting and how many hundreds of people would come here and that it would defeat the purpose of our, getting a full presentation from Patrick and then being able to ask him all the questions that we had with him having to let people in and then letting people out. But that my understanding was that moving forward, we were going to figure out a way to see the attendees, at least during public comment period.
Yeah, I think the two options really are using webinar and during the public comment period, promoting people to panelists who, and I guess I'm still a little unclear if it was every attendee getting promoted to panelists, whether they had something to say or not, or if it was only attendees who had something to say. That would benefit from some clarity there. But you basically give panelist permissions to attendees. And then when that portion of the meeting's done, we take away those panelist permissions or leave them on as panelists, and then they're in and they have the same access level that you do as board members. But it's either it's meetings where everyone's little faces are on the screen as they are now, or it's webinar where you can sort of move them in and move them out.
Okay, I'm gonna say done on the survey unless I hear anything else.
Okay, thank you. Oh, Liz, did you have something to say?
Yeah, I wanted to appreciate our student input today, especially if we could put that on the survey, that would be great. Thanks.
That's a great idea. Thank you. Okay, so at this point, is there a motion to adjourn?
Can I pause on that? I'm not clear what I'm expected to prepare for the next board meeting. If it's going to be a webinar and we let people in and move them out, or if it's going to be a meeting and everyone's in.
I vote for just a regular Zoom session without the webinar for a regular meeting. I've been to a couple of them on select board meetings and other meetings, and I don't really see that being a problem. And it gives you the benefit of being able to do a breakout room for executive session. You don't have to bounce back and forth between Zoom sessions. And if we have a special meeting like this, then we can change format to make it more controlled.
Steve, would that would still be viewable to the public in real time, right?
Yeah, I mean, a regular Zoom meeting is just everybody's in.
Oh, you're saying a regular Zoom meeting where everybody's in. There's
Everybody's in, like they would all be sitting in the cafeteria. We're all in.
Yeah.
You know, there's still rules of when you can talk and when you can't. There's no having to worry about whether you have permission to see people or not.
I like that idea, Steve.
Liz?
I think maybe more breaks in the agenda for public comment perhaps, but like maybe it's just me, but I can find it hard to even find space when there's so much going on and so many different things to be said. So it would be, I mean, it would be great if there was a space for public comment, and maybe we could do better at that, at explaining how you could get on the list to get your turn to talk, or not have the time limits and all of that. If there was a way that we could break it out, because it's hard even amongst our group to necessarily get all of your thoughts out there, I feel, within the time frame that we have to talk. Thanks.
Okay, we'll give it a shot with the Zoom meeting now that we're all clear, I think, on how we're going to do it, and we'll give it a shot and make adjustments if needed. Okay. Now, are you ready to adjourn?
So moved.
All right, Steve and Andrew. All right, all those in favor of adjourning at 9 o'clock, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? Any abstentions? All right, thank you all so much. And
thank you, Patrick.
See you
Thank
next
you,
week.
Patrick.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Patrick.
everyone. Good night.
Good night.
Sure.